What if I told you the U.S. economy is already collapsing, just slowly enough that people mistake it for normal life? It's becoming harder to ignore the feeling that something in America is shifting beneath everyone's feet. Not in a loud, sudden earthquake, but in a slow, unsettling tremor that people sense every day without fully understanding why. You see it in the grocery aisles where shoppers silently pick up items, flip them over, and put them back down because the number on the tag doesn't match the money left in their wallet. You feel it in the parking lots where families sit inside their cars a little too long, trying to decide what they can afford today and what needs to wait until next week. You hear it in conversations between coworkers who talk about rent increases like they're discussing a natural disaster, something unavoidable, something they just have to survive. And everywhere you go, the same quiet sentence appears in people's voices. Something is wrong. No one needs a headline to tell them that the country is stretching itself thin. The middle class, once considered the backbone of the U.S., now feels just as fragile as the people who once dreamed of joining it. Paychecks don't grow, but costs rise like they're running a race, and Americans have no choice but to chase them. It's that chase, constant, exhausting, impossible, that reveals the truth. The United States isn't heading toward an economic meltdown someday in the future. It's already walking toward it now, one small step at a time, through hundreds of tiny cracks that have quietly appeared in everyday life. People don't usually notice the beginning of a crisis. They notice the middle of it, when the news finally catches up, or the end of it, when the damage is already too deep to reverse. But what's happening right now is the beginning, and it looks nothing like the dramatic collapses shown in movies. It looks normal. It feels ordinary. The shelves are full, the lights are on, the markets are open. But beneath that normal surface, the foundations are weakening. More families than ever are using credit cards not for luxuries, but for cereal, milk, detergent, and diapers. More people than ever are taking side jobs, late-night shifts, or weekend gigs just to keep their living situation stable. And more households than ever are reporting that one unexpected bill, a medical emergency, a car repair, even a high utility month, could throw their entire life off balance. This isn't just financial pressure anymore. It's a nationwide stress test that millions are failing quietly behind closed doors. The numbers show it, but the emotions reveal it even more clearly. Americans aren't simply struggling. They're bracing. They're preparing without realizing they're preparing, adjusting their habits, shrinking their expectations, tightening their budgets, all because they can feel something heavy moving toward them. What makes this moment even more dangerous is that it's happening silently, without a breaking news alert or a dramatic event to warn people. The warning signs are scattered across the country like small red lights blinking on a dashboard, each one harmless on its own, but terrifying when seen together. Grocery prices reaching levels no one imagined possible. Rents increasing faster than wages in almost every major city. Utilities and insurance doubling while incomes remain frozen. Car payments becoming as large as mortgages. Debt rising even as spending power collapses. Parents working 2 jobs and still borrowing money from relatives to make it through the month. Retirees returning to work because their savings suddenly feel too thin for the world they're living in. And younger generations abandoning their dreams of homes, families, and stability because those goals no longer fit inside the economy they were handed. This is what the beginning of a meltdown looks like. Not empty shelves, not riots, not chaos, but millions of small financial cuts that weaken a society from the inside until one final push sends everything downward. This slow-burning crisis is the part no one is prepared for because it doesn't feel like a crisis yet. It feels like a grind. It feels like living in a country where every year demands more from the people but gives less in return. It feels like being stuck in a system where working harder doesn't guarantee safety anymore. But this is exactly how major collapses begin. Quietly, steadily, invisibly, through stress that builds until it reaches a breaking point. And America is getting close to that point, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. If you zoom out from the everyday struggles inside ordinary households and look at the larger economic picture, the warning signs become even more alarming because the cracks forming in America's financial system aren't small hairline fractures. They're widening, deepening, and spreading across every layer of the economy in ways that even experts can't fully explain anymore. It starts with the national debt, a number so large it barely feels real, yet its impact quietly touches every part of American life. The country now owes more than any generation before it could even imagine, and instead of slowing down, that number is growing at a speed that looks more like a runaway train than a controlled financial strategy. Politicians call it complex, economists call it concerning, but ordinary people don't need fancy labels. They can feel the consequences directly. Every increase in the cost of borrowing trickles down to citizens like a slow leak becoming a flood. Higher interest rates make mortgages unreachable, car loans unbearable, and credit cards dangerous. And when the government itself struggles under massive debt, the burden doesn't disappear. It gets pushed onto the people, who are already stretched to the edge. Beneath that soaring national debt lies another crack even more personal: the explosion of credit card balances. Americans are holding record levels of credit card debt, not because they're suddenly irresponsible, but because the system has quietly forced them into it. People aren't buying luxury vacations or new gadgets with their cards. They're paying for groceries, school clothes, gas, and basic bills. The interest rates have climbed to unbelievable levels, turning every swipe into a long-term financial trap that grows larger each month. This isn't normal consumer behavior. It's survival spending. It's families relying on borrowed money just to maintain a version of life that used to be achievable with a single paycheck. And when millions of people start using credit not as a convenience, but as a lifeline, it signals that the foundation of the economy is no longer supporting the people living inside it. Then there are the loan defaults: car loans, mortgages, personal loans, and even the new buy now, pay later systems that were supposed to make life easier but have quietly become another form of debt Americans can't keep up with. Car loan defaults are rising faster than they have in decades. And it's not because people aren't working or aren't trying. It's because cars that once cost $18,000 now cost $38,000, and monthly payments look more like mortgage installments than transportation costs. Mortgage delinquencies are creeping upward too, a warning sign that many choose to ignore because the housing market looks stable on the surface. But beneath that surface are homeowners who are one missed paycheck away from losing everything. Even buy now, pay later programs, marketed as interest-free and harmless, have turned into silent trouble, with people juggling payments across multiple apps just to keep up with basic purchases. These patterns mirror the same kinds of cracks that appeared before major downturns in the past, but this time they're deeper because they are combining with a cost-of-living crisis that has left Americans with almost no room to breathe. And while these financial cracks grow wider, there's a growing sense that no one is stepping in to patch them. Banks are tightening their standards, lending less freely, and quietly raising their own rates and fees to protect themselves from what they see coming. Small banks in particular, often the backbone of local communities, are now under stress from both rising defaults and shrinking deposits. When small banks feel pressure, it's a sign that the deeper financial system is unstable, because these smaller institutions are the first to feel economic pain before it spreads upward into bigger markets. Add to that the volatile stock market, which rises and falls unpredictably like it's running on emotion instead of economics. And you get an ecosystem where confidence is fading and uncertainty is quietly taking control. All of these cracks, soaring national debt, exploding credit card balances, rising defaults, and stressed banks, aren't isolated issues. They're connected, feeding into one another like dry branches waiting for a spark. And when a system becomes this stretched, it doesn't take a dramatic event to cause a meltdown. It takes one small shift, one bad month, one unexpected shock. America has reached a point where even tiny disruptions can create massive ripples because the financial foundation underneath millions of households is already too fragile to absorb anything more. The country is standing on a shaky structure, and the weight of everyday life is becoming too heavy for it to hold. The cracks are spreading, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like the system is no longer preparing to bend. It's preparing to break. Across the country, the signs of a deeper economic meltdown aren't hidden in charts or buried inside financial reports. They're happening right in front of people, in plain daylight, woven into the most ordinary moments of everyday American life. You see it first in the grocery stores, where inflation has stopped being a headline and has become a routine shock. People walk through the aisles expecting disappointment, expecting the numbers to be higher each week, expecting the package to look a little smaller, even if the price doesn't. Shrinkflation has become so common that families now spend time comparing weights and sizes just to make sure they're not being silently tricked out of value. Parents calculate meals like math problems, switching brands, skipping favorites, and planning their week around what's on sale instead of what their family actually wants. A grocery run that used to feel like a simple chore now feels like a stress test, a moment where people confront the reality that their money buys less, their patience stretches thinner, and their worry grows larger. This is one of the biggest warning signs. When the basics of everyday life no longer feel stable or predictable, the entire system starts to feel like it's slipping out of control. Then there's the slow disappearance of the middle class, not with dramatic headlines, but with quiet erosion. You see it in the number of people working 2 or even 3 jobs just to maintain a lifestyle they once supported with one. You hear it in conversations about burnout, about weekend shifts, about side gigs that were supposed to be temporary but have now become permanent parts of survival. The middle class used to represent comfort, stability, and the promise of moving upward. Now it represents exhaustion. People who once had savings now have credit card balances. People who once took vacations now take extra shifts. People who once felt secure now live one financial emergency away from falling into a place they never imagined themselves being. When the middle class begins to crack, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Because it's the middle class that once kept the economy balanced, spending enough to keep businesses alive while earning enough to keep themselves afloat. Now, both sides of that equation are failing. Another major warning sign is the way corporations have responded to the crisis, not by helping stabilize the system, but by quietly raising prices even as their profits continue to grow. People can feel it. They know that not every increase is caused by supply shortages or inflation. Some of it is simply opportunistic pricing, taking advantage of a moment when the world is distracted and families are too overwhelmed to fight back. Grocery chains, utility companies, insurance providers, many are posting strong profits, while insisting they have no choice but to raise costs. This disconnect between corporate success and household struggle is more than unfair. It's dangerous. When companies thrive while citizens break, the imbalance grows so wide that collapse becomes easier to trigger and harder to reverse. At the same time, America's cities are undergoing a quiet shift. People are leaving expensive urban centers in record numbers, searching for relief in smaller towns or cheaper states. But that migration creates new problems. Services shrink, businesses close, and tax bases collapse, leaving behind hollowed-out communities that look stable from afar but feel unstable to the people living inside them. Homelessness rises not because people refuse to work, but because wages can't keep up with rents, and one misfortune, an illness, a job change, a landlord selling a property, can push even hard-working families into crisis. Tents under bridges, cars filled with belongings, shelters overflowing. These are not isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a system cracking from the bottom up. Local banks, too, are signaling distress. They're approving fewer loans, raising more requirements, and tightening standards because they see what the public doesn't. Rising defaults, shrinking deposits, and growing risk in every direction. When local banks begin to struggle, it's a sign that households are already drowning before national headlines catch on. A stable financial system depends on confidence, and right now, that confidence is fading faster than anyone wants to admit. All of these warning signs, shrinking groceries, collapsing middle-class stability, rising corporate profits paired with rising consumer pain, population shifts, homelessness spikes, and local bank stress are like blinking red lights on a dashboard. Each one is concerning on its own, but together they paint a portrait of a country shutting down from financial pressure. This isn't something that might happen someday. It's happening now, slowly, quietly, in thousands of small ways that people feel before they ever see it on the news. And every warning sign adds weight to a system that is already dangerously close to breaking. There's a reason many economists, financial analysts, and even ordinary Americans feel an uneasy tension about the year 2025. It isn't because they expect some sudden collapse or a single event that brings the country to its knees. It's because all the pressures that have been building for years are now converging at the same time, creating a perfect storm that households are already feeling in real time. The foundation of the American economy is cracking from multiple directions, and each crack is pushing the country closer to a breaking point that no one is fully prepared to face. Mortgage rates have reached levels that lock out an entire generation from home ownership, turning what was once a milestone of adulthood into a distant fantasy. A 30-year mortgage today costs so much in interest alone that millions of Americans have simply stopped trying. They're staying in rentals, doubling up with roommates, moving back with parents, or settling into smaller, cramped apartments because the dream of owning a home has drifted beyond the horizon. This wouldn't be a major crisis if rents were stable, but rents are soaring even faster than mortgage rates. Families are being squeezed from both sides, unable to buy and unable to afford long-term renting, leaving them trapped in an endless cycle with no clear path forward. Rent surpassing income in so many cities is one of the clearest signs that the system is no longer functioning. When people spend half or more of their paycheck just to keep a roof over their heads, there's no space left for emergencies, savings, or even basic comfort. And as wages refuse to rise in proportion to housing costs, more families are slipping into overcrowded living situations, sharing small spaces with relatives, or cutting essential expenses just to stay current on rent. The housing market is no longer just expensive. It has become predatory, unstable, and entirely out of sync with reality. This pressure doesn't just strain households, it strains communities, economies, and entire states. At the same time, small businesses, once the backbone of many American towns, are collapsing under the weight of high costs. Rising rent for commercial spaces, expensive utilities, costly supplies, and higher interest rates on business loans have combined into a financial trap that many owners simply can't escape. Every week, another small cafe, barber shop, restaurant, or repair shop quietly shuts down, leaving behind empty storefronts that become symbols of a shrinking local economy. Once these small businesses close, communities lose more than a service. They lose jobs, foot traffic, and the personality that made those neighborhoods feel alive. And when small businesses vanish, the economy becomes even more dependent on massive corporations, the same ones that raise prices whenever they want. This imbalance, where giant companies thrive while small businesses suffocate, is another powerful sign that 2025 is pushing the country toward a dangerous threshold. Households are being crushed in a high-interest environment that refuses to ease up. Every loan, every card, every payment has become heavier. People who once managed their debt now find themselves watching balances grow even when they're making payments. Interest has turned into a form of quiet punishment, dragging families into deeper financial stress even when they're doing everything right. You hear more people saying they're scared to open their banking apps. More people admitting they pay the minimum because that's all they can manage. More people realizing their debt is growing faster than their income. This environment turns everyday living into a financial battle that feels unwinnable. What makes all of these pressures so dangerous is the return of survival spending, a phrase that describes exactly what millions of Americans are doing now, focusing only on the absolute essentials and cutting everything else. Restaurants, travel, clothing, entertainment, services, all the industries that depend on discretionary spending are quietly feeling the impact as people tighten their budgets and redirect every dollar to rent, food, bills, and debt. When a nation collectively stops spending on anything beyond survival, the economy slows down, businesses lose revenue, jobs disappear, and the cycle becomes self-reinforcing. This is exactly how downturns begin, not with panic, but with hesitation, fear, and pullback. And beneath all of it is record-level anxiety. People are worried not about the next year, but about the next week. They're thinking about layoffs, about bills, about childcare, about food, about the future they once felt confident about, but now feel disconnected from. When a nation's emotional state becomes defined by fear, it changes spending habits, lifestyle choices, and long-term decisions. Fear slows economies down faster than any policy, and 2025 is shaping up to be a year fueled by fear, uncertainty, and financial exhaustion. When you put all these factors together, unreachable mortgages, unaffordable rent, collapsing small businesses, crushing interest rates, shrinking spending, and widespread anxiety, you get a country standing on the edge of a breaking point, not because of one event, but because of many small ones happening all at once. The pressures that were once separate have now collided, creating a moment where even a minor shock could trigger a major meltdown. And the most unsettling part is that millions of Americans can feel this shift in their daily lives, long before the news decides to acknowledge it. If the United States does reach a meltdown moment, it won't look like the dramatic Hollywood version people imagine. There won't be sudden chaos, explosions, or mass panic in the streets. It will look like something far quieter, far slower, and far more painful. A nationwide tightening that becomes impossible to ignore. It would begin with spending slowing down so sharply that businesses feel it in their numbers almost instantly. Restaurants that once stayed full on weekends would start seeing empty tables. Retail stores that relied on impulse buys would notice carts rolling through checkout with fewer items. Travel plans would fade, vacations would disappear, and entertainment venues would quietly cut hours or staff. This kind of pullback might seem small on the surface, but it's the exact signal that tells an economy it has begun to shrink from the inside. When millions of households switch into survival mode all at once, the country shifts onto a path that becomes very hard to reverse. From there, the effects would ripple outward. Mass layoffs wouldn't happen in one brutal wave. They would begin slowly and spread month by month as companies tighten budgets, reduce shifts, and eliminate roles that aren't essential. People would go to work one day and find out their hours were cut the next. Job listings would shrink, hiring freezes would spread, and workers who once felt secure would suddenly be competing with thousands of others for the same handful of openings. The emotional toll of that kind of uncertainty would be heavy. Families already stretched thin would start making impossible choices. Should they skip insurance payments to buy groceries? Should they sell their car just to pay rent? Should they move in with relatives because the cost of living alone has become too much? These decisions would stop feeling like personal failures and start feeling like the new normal in a country that has forgotten how to protect its own people. A credit freeze is another part of the meltdown that would hit hard. Banks, already anxious from rising defaults, would begin approving fewer loans, raising more requirements, and rejecting people who once easily qualified. Mortgages would become nearly impossible to secure. Auto loans would require stronger credit and larger down payments. Personal loans would become rare. When access to credit tightens, the economy slows down even further because people can't spend, can't invest, and can't move forward. Economic mobility becomes a memory instead of a reality. This is how a slowdown turns into a freeze, when people want to act, but the system refuses to let them. Housing would stagnate under these pressures. Sellers would hold on to their homes because no one can afford to buy. Buyers would vanish because mortgages are too expensive. The market would become a gridlock of desperate sellers, cautious lenders, and frustrated buyers. Prices might not crash dramatically, but they would freeze where they are, locking millions of Americans into places they don't want to be, and trapping younger generations in a permanent state of waiting. Meanwhile, rents would continue to rise or stay painfully high, because landlords would pass their own financial stress onto tenants. Housing, already a broken piece of the system, would become one of the hardest burdens for families to carry. Grocery unaffordability would worsen too. Prices wouldn't drop just because people are struggling. They would hold steady, or even rise in some areas due to supply issues, transportation costs, and corporate pricing strategies. Families would buy less food, cheaper food, or rely on food banks more than ever before. You'd see parents skipping meals so their children could eat. You'd see adults stretching a week's worth of groceries across 2 weeks. You'd see communities forming informal food-sharing groups just to survive. These aren't dramatic movie scenes. They're real-life consequences of a society pushed beyond its financial limits. What makes this possible meltdown even more tragic is the way it divides the country. Ordinary families would feel every ounce of the pain, while the wealthiest segments, protected by assets, investments, and savings, would barely feel the shift at all. The gap between the struggling and the insulated would widen into something that no longer feels like inequality, but like two separate realities. One America fighting to afford milk and rent, and another continuing life unchanged. But even in a scenario this heavy, there is always something that emerges from the cracks. A form of clarity. When systems break, people begin to see the truth behind them. They start questioning not just prices and policies, but the very structure they've been told to trust. They reevaluate what matters, what they really need, and how they want to live. A meltdown forces a reckoning, with debt, with housing, with work, with community, with the myth that everything will always stay stable because it always has. Sometimes collapse isn't just an end, it's a spotlight. It reveals what was broken all along. And if there is anything that comes after the meltdown, it won't be a return to normal. It will be the beginning of something rebuilt, whether by choice or necessity, by the people who endured the collapse and refused to let the country stay broken forever.